Hey guys, so welcome to our lecture on Chapter 3 of The Great Gatsby. So this one, because Chapter 3 is such an important part of our story and such an important moment in our story, I've decided to do this as a video lecture with some text annotations along with it, so that way we could have a better understanding of what we're doing in Chapter 3 and make sure that you have a really clear understanding of the significance of this chapter. It is a little bit longer than we usually do, which is another reason I've decided to do this as a video instead of as like a live chat kind of thing. So also because since it will be a little bit longer, I don't want you guys to feel like you're going to have to choose between like doing this with us or being in another class and getting other instruction. So this will give you time to watch it when you have time to do that. Also, because it is a little bit longer, you might want to break it into two different sections. I mean, it's not like 3 hours long, but it is a lot of like information to take in all at once, and so that way you can kind of manage it as works best for you. Honestly, also, I keep forgetting to record our chats when we do them on Teams, so this was a better way for me to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to get it. So with Chapter 3, this is the first time that we actually get to meet Gatsby, as I'm sure you realized, and we also get an introduction to the parties that he throws. So as of right now, for chapters 1 and 2, all we've really seen in chapter 1 is this like image of Gatsby on the lawn, standing isolated by himself. We talked about like the Christ imagery with his arms out. We talked about the significance of the green light, the different symbolic resonances of that. But again, we still don't have a lot of information about Gatsby himself. The other thing in chapter 2, we've got Catherine McKee, who's giving us kind of all these different rumors about Gatsby. He's like the cousin of Kaiser Wilhelm and all of that kind of good stuff. So at this point, there's not a lot that's concrete about Gatsby that we know. Chapter 3 really brings us into the world of Jay Gatsby for the first time. And so that starts actually at the very beginning of chapter 3 in the first couple sentences. You'll see that I'm looking down because I've got my book and my notes right here, so I'm sorry if you keep seeing me doing that. I want to read the first two sentences to you because they're super evocative and really interesting. So it says, "There was music from my neighbor's house through the summer nights. In his blue gardens, men and girls came and went like moths among the whisperings and the champagne and the stars." I gotta say, chapter 3 of Gatsby might be one of my favorite pieces of literature to study. I just think it's so interesting. I think it's so, there's so many ways that this chapter kind of radiates outward into the rest of the text. And so I want to kind of make sure that we have an introduction to those significant moments in order for us to see the resonances of them as we continue to work through that. So with that being said, I want to take a look at the first part of this chapter and a lot of the imagery that is given to us by Fitzgerald of this party itself. So as we're moving through, we're getting a lot of description of the preparation for the party, the food, the drinks, kind of this like over the top, kind of exaggerated, all of these different, types of food and types of drinks. We get this Christmas imagery, right? Like he's got the Christmas light. So it's supposed to really evoke in us this idea of like bounty and this imagery of excess. And so we see that, we get a lot of that preparation, but then really kind of about 2 pages into the chapter, we get some discussion of what the party itself is like. And so I'd like to take a moment and take a look at that. So as we look at our first set of text, this is from the very beginning of the chapter where we are given this description of the party. One of the things I want to point out to you guys, you can see here that we have present tense verbs that are happening, right? The swimmers have come in, the verandas are full, the bar is in full swing, the air is alive. And so we have moved, if you've noticed, from Nick telling us the story in past tense, we have this tense shift here to present tense. And so it brings a sense of immediacy to us as readers because we're like, oh, look, this is all happening right now. Again, we have the way that this text moves through time and also through descriptions. It's like we are actually getting to experience this party in the same way that that an attendee actually would as well. So Fitzgerald is giving us a lot of descriptions of like the bar, the garden, the way that the people are interacting. He talks about like there's this intensity that happens throughout this particular passage. He says the lights grow brighter as the earth lurches away from the sun. The orchestra is playing yellow cocktail music. So we've got that same synesthesia that we heard actually at the very beginning when he talks about there was music from his neighbor's house and in the blue gardens. Again, we have all of these different kind of movement that's happening, right? So again, this kind of intensity and movement that's happening through the language, and it's really interesting here because we have these women who are these confident girls who it says weave here and there. They become the center of a group and then they exit through the sea change of faces and voices and color under the constantly changing light. So it's interesting because we have this, it's almost like he's describing them with like schools of fish, right? Like the way that they move through and they come together and then they break apart. And then we have this moment where he says the party has begun. And so we have this shift, and you'll notice after we leave this text, when we go back into the rest of the chapter, you'll notice that he moves us away from this present tense description and back into the past tense. But it's interesting how he uses those verb tenses and those descriptions to impart this kind of exaggerated and heightened momentum through his description and through his language. So we have this description of the party, and then as we keep reading, we understand that Nick is actually attending this party. And in fact, he tells us twice that he is the only person who's received an invitation. He is very excited about the fact that he has actually been invited. He will continue to mention it, but he mentions it twice in the space of one page in chapter 3. It's interesting because he also, even though he's been invited, and so that should make him feel very welcome and make him feel like he's a part of the action, he feels very separated, and in fact feels a lot of discomfort about being there. He says he doesn't know anybody, and he says that he was on his way to getting roaring drunk from sheer embarrassment when he runs into Jordan Baker. Remember Jordan from chapter 1? She's the golfer, she's friends with Tom and Daisy. So he runs back into Jordan, and it like kind of attaches himself to her because that's the way that he's going to get through this. So it's interesting because as we read through the next part of the chapter where Nick is kind of walking around with Jordan and seeing people and she's interacting with people, one of the things that we should realize is that we don't get a lot of names, right? Like it talks about like there's, a girl that Jordan speaks to, like we get Lucille's name, but like we don't know who she is or anything like that. She's just a friend. It talks about how they're sitting at a table and that they all get introduced to men that they call like Mr. Mumble. So it's like they're trailing off. They're looking for this anonymity. They're looking to be anonymous because the focus of identity for this chapter is on the identity of Gatsby himself, right? Because that's what Nick is trying to figure out is who is Gatsby. And so that's where we get these moments where we have all these different rumors that come up that Lucille kind of imparts to Jordan and Nick. And so we get the rumor that he killed a man. We get the rumor that he was a German spy, and then somebody else goes, well, no, that's not right because he was in the American army, so it can't be a German spy, right? So again, this mythologizing of Gatsby that we need to be aware of. Nobody is very clear on what his history is or where he's from or even really who he is. And it's interesting because at the end of these moments, this conversation, Fitzgerald, through Nick, tells us it was testimony to the romantic speculation he inspired that there were whispers about him from those who had found little that it was necessary to whisper about in this world. So even the people who have all the information, the people who are in the know, the people who are in the in crowd, the people who are not afraid of scandal or gossip or anything like that, they're the ones who are whispering about Gatsby. So he inspires that kind of like awe through this the mysterious nature of the fact that his identity is totally obscured, right? And it's obscured, but also on display at the same time, right? We've just seen all the description of the display of the party itself. So as they're sitting there at dinner, they're experiencing, all of this display that we've just talked about and all the entertainment and the over-the-top nature of this gathering. Jordan is like, we're gonna move on. We're gonna go look at something else. And this is where they go into the library and they meet everyone's favorite character, Owl Eyes. So let's talk for a minute about who Owl Eyes is. He is a party goer. He says he's been at Gatsby's for a week and he's been drunk that whole time. And he is in the library because he needs to sober up. So that he's like, where do you go to get sober? Clearly the library. So he has this really interesting exchange with Jordan and Nick that illuminates in a lot of ways how people view Gatsby from this kind of outsider perspective. So I'd like to take a look at the text where Owl Eyes and Jordan and Nick kind of talk about what they think or who they think Gatsby is or what he's like. Okay, so when Owl Eyes meets Nick and Jordan in the library, as we've talked about, he's there because he is trying to sober up, and he's also giving us some insight into the way that people perceive Gatsby. So the first thing that he is interested in, and the first thing that he tells us is they're real. They're absolutely real. He repeats that. And so it's really contradicting Owl Eye's expectation of Gatsby, right? Because Owl Eyes, in some ways, is the character that understands Gatsby the best, right? All of this ostentation, these huge parties, this gigantic house, all of the excess that we've talked about that's illustrated at the beginning of this chapter. Owl Eyes, because of all of that excess, expects Gatsby's life to be false, right? Expects it to be fake, expects it to be all a show. So he understands better than some other characters the illusory, the fake nature of Gatsby's life because he tells us what he expects, right? He expects them to be a nice, durable cardboard, right? So something that is flimsy, something that doesn't last, something that is only just for show. And so he is really taken aback by the fact that these books are real. Again, absolutely real. We see that repetition again happening there, pages and everything. And so he emphasizes this reality by calling it a bona fide piece of printed matter. So he's talking about the reality and the kind of authentic nature of this, but he immediately undercuts this by making this comparison of Gatsby to Belasco. So this allusion is to Belasco, who is a theatrical director, somebody who creates sets for, and does set design. And so what this illusion really shows us is that Owl Eye sees Gatsby and sees Gatsby's whole life as a production. And he goes on to talk about what thoroughness, what realism. So again, Gatsby's life is a creative production. It's a creative endeavor. It's not a real life. Notice that in this particular case, Owl Eyes doesn't talk about he doesn't say it's real, like his life is real. He says it is realism. It is as if it is real. It is an illusion again. And he totally insults Gatsby, right? Because he says he knew when to stop too. He didn't cut the pages. And so what he's referring to there is this, when books were printed, as you read them, you cut the pages open, right? And that's how you showed that you had read them. Because as they were printed, they were kind of folded, and so you would have to cut them to show, or to get to the next page. And so there's this insult here, right? Because Owl Eyes is saying that even if people initially believed that the books themselves were real, no one would believe that Gatsby had actually read them. So he's like, great, good job. You didn't spoil the illusion by acting like you had read them and cutting them open. The last thing about this piece of text that I want to show to us, or I want to point out to us, is this last sentence. He says, he snatched the book from me and replaced it hastily on its shelf, muttering that if one brick was removed, the whole library was liable to collapse. And so what we have in that sentence is this connection or this comparison to the library and, by extension, Gatsby's whole house and whole life as a house of cards, right? If you remove one brick from the library, if you remove one book from the library, everything is liable to collapse. And so this allusion to a house of cards, this comparison to a house of cards, reveals the inherent fragility of the facade that Gatsby has created. And it's interesting that Owl Eyes, who again is somebody who is kind of watching, right? He is the person who sees through this illusion. He's like, it's so real, but it is not actually real. It looks real, but is not itself real. I do also want to point out again, Owl Eyes. He is another character that we meet who is not given a name because, again, remember the focus for this particular chapter is on Gatsby's identity and learning more about that. So after Nick and Jordan have this interaction with Owl Eyes, they go outside. They leave the library, they go back outside, and they rejoin the party. One of the things I want to point out to you guys about this chapter is the cinematic quality of Fitzgerald's writing. You can really kind of think of this chapter like a movie, right? Because we move from these kind of like large overall shots or descriptions of the party itself and the people who are there and what's happening on a larger scale, and then Fitzgerald takes and moves kind of inward to these more intimate moments, right, where we get the conversations between Nick and Jordan, where we get the conversations between Nick, Jordan, and Owl Eyes. So we have a lot of kind of like large focus and then smaller focus as well, like a more focused and intimate kind of quality as well. And so once Nick and Jordan leave Owl Eyes, they go back to the party. We're in this kind of larger atmosphere again. And I want to point out a couple things about Nick really quickly before we move on. So Nick tells us he and Jordan are sitting at a table with a man of about my age, as well as some other people, specifically this rowdy little girl that he talks about. But Nick, in contrast to his earlier discomfort, says, I was enjoying myself now. And so what's the change? Let's take a look. Nick says, I had taken 2 finger bowls of champagne and the scene had changed before my eyes into something significant, elemental, and profound. And so Nick's drunk again, right? Like that's what's happening here. So one of the things that we need to continue to think about and continue to deal with is Nick's reliability and the kind of the blind spots that Nick has about himself, because this is an important thing, right? It's an important thing to note when your narrator is being truthful with you as the reader, but also with himself. And that's a quality that Nick seems to lack a little bit. So as we keep reading, Nick gets involved with this conversation with the man of about his age. They talk about kind of their shared experience in the war. And Nick mentions to this man, he says, I haven't even seen the host. And surprise, surprise, the man turns to him and says, I'm Gatsby. And so here's the first time that we meet Gatsby.
How do you do, old sport? I'm Gatsby.
I'm Gatsby.
So here's the first extended description of Gatsby that we get. Remember that Nick has only just told us, the only thing you kind of recognize about this man is that he was, quote, a man of about my age. And now here's where we actually get to see Gatsby speak to Nick. We get to see Gatsby and Nick interact in a more meaningful way. And we get Nick kind of giving us his understanding of who or what Gatsby is and is like. So it's interesting because the first thing that Nick talks about with Gatsby, of course, is his smile, right? He says it was one of those rare smiles with a quality of eternal reassurance in it that you may come across 4 or 5 times in life. It's interesting, too, because notice that this smile is all about the way that it makes Nick feel, right? I want you guys to look at the parallel structure in this particular sentence, right? He says, it understood you just so far as you wanted to be understood, believed in you as you would like to believe in yourself, and assured you that it had precisely the impression of you that you, at your best, hoped to convey. So all of those verbs, the understanding, the believing, and the assuring, notice that parallel structure. It's always followed by you, right? So when Nick is giving us this description, it's talking about how this smile makes you feel. It has an irresistible prejudice in your favor. So it's all about, in some ways, Nick is falling prey to the same kind of things that other people around Gatsby have fallen prey to, right? This obsession with like the things that Gatsby gives out, whether that is, dresses or liquor or parties, and in this case with Nick, it's this idea of like reassurance and this idea of believing in you. So it's interesting because we have this overwhelmingly positive description of Gatsby and Gatsby's smile. And then suddenly, it says, precisely at that point, it vanished, right? So we have had this kind of elaborate and impressive and positive setup, and then we have this turn. The smile vanishes, and here's what Nick says about him after that. He says, I was looking at an elegant young roughneck a year or two over 30, whose elaborate formality of speech just missed being absurd. And so we have this contrast with this, like, your smile makes me feel like everything is wonderful and is right with the world, and you have that kind of reassuring quality to you. And then we contrast that with this judgmental statement where he says, he calls him like a roughneck. So again, we're looking here at this like lack of sophistication and culture in his appearance. And we also get Nick judging the way that Gatsby speaks, right? The elaborate formality of speech that just missed being absurd. Sometime before he introduced himself, I got the strong impression that he was picking his words with care. So Nick here is judging kind of the way that he speaks and presents himself, or the way he chooses to speak and present himself, right? He can't necessarily choose the effect of his smile, but he can choose the way that he dresses himself and the words that he speaks. So we get the idea that like the true Gatsby here is really kind of what the feelings that Nick gets from the way that Gatsby smiles at him, right? Like that's who Gatsby is this person who is positive, who has this, reassuring and comforting and, quality of belief, but it's kind of masked by this outward appearance. By the clothes that he chooses to wear, the way that he chooses to present himself, and the way that he speaks. And of course, this elaborate formality of speech that we will see over and over and over again, I'm sure you have guessed it, it's the old sport, right? He calls everybody, particularly Nick, he calls him old sport. So Nick has finally met Gatsby. It's awkward, as Nick tends to be, but we have finally kind of a concrete description of who he is and what he's like. So even though we have that, even though Nick has met him, we still get him questioning as soon as Gatsby walks away. He looks at Jordan and he says, who is he? Do you know? And Jordan is like, not really. And Jordan kind of is like, are you kidding? I can't believe that you are continuing to ask. You're just as bad as everybody else. She says, now you're started on the subject. And she tells Nick, he told me once he was an Oxford man. However, I don't believe it. And so what we are looking at is Nick kind of continuing to reflect through this chapter on like, who is Gatsby? Where is he from? And he, even though we have like the concrete person of Gatsby, and Nick has talked to him, right? They've introduced themselves. They have this shared background and this shared experience, in the war. Nick still has trouble figuring out who he is because he says, young men didn't, at least in my provincial inexperience, I believe they didn't, drift coolly out of nowhere and buy a palace on Long Island Sound. So he's like, I've met him, but I still don't understand him and I don't know who he is. And so Jordan continues to say like, I don't care who he is. And there we get the famous line that Jordan has where she says, he gives large parties and I like large parties. They're so intimate. At small parties, there isn't any privacy. And so that's one of Jordan's famous lines. So as we are continuing to move through this chapter, Nick continues to, like I said, kind of reflect on Gatsby and who he is and what he's like. And we are presented with this image of, everybody is listening to this music. Everybody is, engaging in this party. And then we have Gatsby standing by himself. And Nick says, my eyes fell on Gatsby, standing alone on the marble steps and looking from one group to another with approving eyes. And so, again, we get this image of Gatsby in isolation, right? Like he is not joining in with the frivolity. He is not a part of this party. He is literally standing apart from it and watching it. So again, this idea of observation that we see in a bunch of our different characters. And so Nick emphasizes this isolation to us. He's talking about after this dance, and he says, no one swooned backward on Gatsby, and no French bob touched Gatsby's shoulder, and no singing quartets were formed with Gatsby's head for one link. So we get this interesting kind of image where, like we said, Gatsby's standing alone, and he is not being involved in this kind of social event that he has engineered, right? This is his party, and he's not engaging. All he's doing is observing. And so that, again, for Nick is hard to understand. And so the polysyndeton in that quote, where we have this, he isn't doing this, and he isn't doing this, and this isn't happening for him, again, really kind of emphasizes the isolation that he has. At this point in the text, this is where Gatsby calls Jordan in for this kind of private conference. We don't know what it's about at this point. But we see that Nick is left alone. He's wandering through the house and through the party. He's kind of observing what he sees. Again, observation. This is all very important. What do people see and how do they feel about it? And what Nick sees in this particular part is a lot of conflict between like husbands and wives. And so there's a lot of interesting things about like morality and marital relationships. Take a closer look at that part of the text if you have time, because it is going to kind of inform the way that we think about like the relationships that we're going to continue to see in this text. But the important thing that I want to move us on, because I don't want to spend so much time on this. But it's interesting because like Jordan leaves this conference with Gatsby and sees Nick, bids him farewell, kind of gives him this invitation to, continue to keep up, like you can find me at this particular place. So there's this kind of like unresolved quality to the evening and to the relationship there. Gatsby bids Nick farewell, and even in this farewell, Nick can't really figure out what Gatsby's deal is, right? There's this all of these moments where he continues to question Gatsby's personality and his motivations, and he kind of goes back and forth between thinking like, oh, he's a really great guy, he's totally sincere, and and then the other side of that is he's like, no, this is all for show. And so Nick has real trouble gauging Gatsby's sincerity. And I think that's why he's hunting so much for like, who is he? What is he like? Because I feel like Nick thinks that's going to give him a better window into, what Gatsby's motives are and why he's doing these things. This brings us to the car crash that happens at the end of the party scene. So I want to talk about that really quickly. So Owl Eyes, our friend who was drunk in the library, Nick sees him standing outside of the house and standing outside of a car that has crashed in a ditch. And this car has lost one of its wheels. Like the wheel is gone. It is not attached. It says that it's been violently shorn of one wheel. And so there's all of this confusion about what has happened and who is driving and everything like that. And what we need to understand, and because we're going to continue to see it, is that Fitzgerald is using these ideas of cars and drivers to deal with ideas of control and responsibility. And so in this case, we have Owl Eyes and then the actual driver of the car who kind of pops out later. But we get both of them who really abdicate responsibility for this like important responsibility of like driving a large piece of equipment, right? That can be really destructive and can be, in some cases fatal if you are mishandling it. And so Owl Eye says, well, I wasn't even trying. And of course, then he clarifies by saying I wasn't the driver. But everybody's like, what? You weren't trying to drive the car? And so the big point at this juncture, this car crash, this car accident is merely an amusing story, but we need to make sure that we pay attention to that. We're going to talk about it again in just a moment. But Fitzgerald comes back to this and comes back to cars and who's driving them and why that's important and how people who are, engaging in those types of activities need to take responsibility for what they're doing. Nick provides us with a break in the narrative here, like once he leaves the party. And so he gives us a lot of description after that of like the time he spends at work and in the city and what he's doing, because he's trying to convince us and maybe himself that like the fact like that he's not necessarily just obsessed with hanging out with Gatsby or hanging out with the Buchanans or hanging out with Jordan. He's like, no, I had all kinds of other things going on in my life. And so he tells us about some of those, particularly, like I said, about his work and his time in the city. But he does return to Jordan. He talks about how he kind of like runs back into her. In Midsummer, I found her again. And he says he's flattered to go at places with her because everybody knows who she is. But after they begin their relationship, this is when Nick remembers what it is that he's heard about Jordan. Remember back in chapter 1, he's like, oh, I know your name for some reason besides just golfing. There's some kind of scandal attached to you. And so now he remembers. They've gone to a house party. She has borrowed a car. She's left it out in the rain. She's left the top down, and the car, gets ruined, and she lies about it. And Nick's like, now I remember. Now I remember what it was. There was a controversy about Jordan and golfing, and that she had cheated, right? She'd moved her ball, and that kind of blew up and then blew away. And so Nick has some things to say about the idea of Jordan and truth and honesty that we're going to take a look at the end of this chapter. His reflection on Jordan Baker after they've been seeing each other for a little while. And this is what he has to say. He says, Jordan Baker instinctively avoided clever, shrewd men. And so the first thing I want to point out is that what does that say about Nick? If she has decided to pursue a relationship with him, it means that in many ways he is the antithesis of this, right? So again, think about how that plays into our understanding of him as a narrator. And so as he goes on, it's interesting because he says, oh, well, that's fine. It's fine that she is avoiding clever, shrewd men. It's fine that she has begun dealing in subterfuges, that she lies. He says, it made no difference to me, because he says, dishonesty in a woman is a thing you never blame deeply. So, there's some casual misogyny there for you. And I want to point that out because in many ways it goes hand in hand with Daisy early in the novel in chapter 1 talking about her daughter and wanting her daughter to be a beautiful fool, right? Because even for men like Nick, who are not like actively abusive racists like Tom, we can see through this kind of quote that Nick still subscribes to the same pattern of thought about women's roles and importance in this society, right? Like, he's like, oh, I was casually sorry that she was a liar, and then I forgot about it. So, he's like, okay, whatevs, that's fine. It's interesting because, like, when he says I forgot, it's almost like he makes us forget as well, because he totally changes the subject, right? About her lying and dishonesty. And he tells us this kind of interesting anecdote that we need to look at, again, about cars and drivers, because Jordan is driving and he says she passed so close to some workmen that our fender flicked a button on one man's coat. So I want to look at this dialogue that happens right here. And about this car incident. It's not an accident. I also want to point out with this that, she almost, it doesn't happen, but she almost hits a road worker. So there's some class commentary happening here as well, right? She is in control of this car. She has the privilege to be driving around. He is performing the labor. So keep that in mind. Along with that class commentary, there's a lot of contrast here between this idea of being careful and being careless, right? And so we need to look at the tension that's happening in this particular piece of text. So Nick says that he wants her to be more careful, and she refused. Like, at first she says, well, I am. And he says, no, you're not. And so she finally acknowledges, well, no, I guess I'm not. But she says, I don't have to be, because other people are careful, right? So again, this abdication of responsibility, right? Other people can be careful. I don't have to be. And Nick says, well, what does that have to do with it? And it's interesting because she says, they'll keep out of my way. And this is such an interesting statement, this kind of paradoxical thing where she says, it takes two to make an accident, right? Which seems to contradict the idea of an accident, right? Something that just kind of happens when she says that an accident is made by two people. What this really shows us is that in Jordan's life, there is always going to be a way to avoid blame or responsibility. There's always going to be someone or something else, this two, for Jordan to kind of push that responsibility onto. And so Nick says, well, what happens if you meet someone just as careless as yourself? And she says, I hope I never will. I hate careless people. So that's commentary about kind of how she thinks about herself and the society around her. She says, I hate careless people. That's why I like you. And so again, ultimately, Nick is there in some ways, to be like her conscience, her sense of responsibility, somebody who is there to take the blame or the responsibility when something bad happens. Again, it's really emphasizing to us his outsider status. So we leave that exchange between Nick and Jordan. And one of the things I want to point out to us is this idea, like we talked about with the worker and Jordan, right? There is this kind of inherent disparity between the social classes, of course, but also when it comes to responsibility as well. Because what we learn through reading this is that people who are careless, people who can afford not to care, and I mean that in like the financial sense of the word as well as like the kind of moral sense of the word, are the people who are of this high in this higher social echelon. So of course people like Jordan, people like Tom and Daisy, even people like Gatsby, they don't have to be responsible. They are able to be careless. And it's other people who have the responsibility of being careful, as Jordan points out. And so Nick kind of ends this chapter by reflecting on maybe how he fits into this a little bit, but we get some of the ways that Nick thinks about and perceives himself, which are really important again to our understanding of this narrative, because of course Nick is our narrator. So what Nick tells us is that he feels like he has this moral obligation to break off the relationship with his previous girlfriend in order for him to continue having this relationship with Jordan, right? And he's like, this is such, such a truthful and important thing that I'm doing. But what I want to remind us of is that after the party, when he first started talking about his life in the city, he talks about how he's already had an affair with somebody in his office, right? So Nick is kind of taking a moral high ground and taking this moral stance that he doesn't necessarily have like the evidence to back up with, but he doesn't understand that kind of like dissonance that's happening there. He definitely thinks of himself as someone who is kind of this arbiter of morality and somebody who is able to kind of comment on the morality of other people because he himself is free of those same type of flaws, even though he's not, obviously. And so he says at the very end, the final sentence of this chapter says, I am one of the few honest people that I have ever known, right? And so it draws attention in a lot of ways to like the gaps and the problems and the lack of self-awareness that Nick has about himself, and possibly also draws attention to like the gaps and the problems and the flaws in the narrative, right? So keep that in mind. I've had students say before, like, oh, you hate Nick so much. It's like, no, I don't hate him. I feel like we need to just be aware that Nick, like all of us, is a flawed human being. And Nick, his biggest flaw is that he thinks that he is very self-aware and he thinks that he has the ability to judge people. But we can see through the things that he just tells us that he is not as self-aware as he purports to be, and maybe not as truthful with himself and others as he purports to be. So keep that in mind. That's an important thing to know about our narrators. That is chapter 3. So hopefully you've been able to get through all of that. Hopefully it has not been too onerous a task. We will get together and talk a little bit more about chapter 3 and chapter 4 as well upcoming. So thank you for watching, and I will see you guys soon.